Now, I have read recently in the Soviet press some people's thoughts that perhaps more attention should be given to the role of woman as a homemaker who primarily brings up the children. Do you feel that this side is underestimated or not?
Our Russian women pay great attention for children too. Mm-hmm. We like our children very much, certainly. We speak about 70% of physicians and teachers as women. I can tell you that if we compare the quantity of women among physicians this period of time, if we speak about our young generation, and compare this data with my generation, we are right if we speak about my generation, because certainly we have most of our physicians and teachers are women, but it is a consequence of the war, because most of our men of my generation were killed during the war. But now, for example, this year, I speak about our institute, we have equal relations between women and men who graduate from institute.
A more normal balance.
Oh yes, certainly. Now we have normal balance.
Like Irina Alexandrovna, many Russian women work outside the home, and this does not diminish their attachment to family life. Perhaps because there has been so much suffering and loss of life here in the past 50 years, the Russians place special emphasis on the education and upbringing of their children. The stories and nursery rhymes of Kornei Chukovsky are known to children all over the land, and his book about the young and how they absorb language in the years from 2 to 5 is popular with parents across the country. At 85, Chukovsky is still going strong, holding court, as it were, at his home under the tall pines of Peredelkino outside Moscow. The day we went out there, the neighborhood children came running over. They played together, and he told them, when the pine cone hits the target, we'll all shout, hurrah! And when it doesn't, we'll all sadly say, увы, which means, alas.
Пожалуйста, вот бросайте свои именики, мы будем считать. Увы! Увы!
Немного.
5 ура и 3 увы. Ура! Моя дочь там работает.
When illiteracy had been eliminated in this country, and illiteracy among children, there arose, of course, an enormous interest in the children's book. This is a good standard by which to measure culture in general. Formerly, there were no children's books at all in the villages. Who doesn't know that good verses, good stories, and so on are necessary for the moral and artistic development of the child? Our child raising was based on national traditions, but of course there were many very unpleasant moments. At one time the fairy tale was forbidden. We had to tell fairy tales in secret, or they obliged us to relate them to all kinds of elements of industrial production. Of course all this had nothing to do with poetry, and it was boring for the children.
This is a Chukovsky tongue twister about a barefoot billy goat and a cross-eyed nanny goat, and vice versa. And believe me, it is hard to say.
Коза с козой уже выходит. Нет, нет, кто-нибудь другой, пожалуйста. Кто еще руку поднимает? Ну, давай. Шел козел с косой козой. Запомнили? Шел козел с босой козой. Шла коза с косым козлом. Шла коза с босым козлом. Вот он-то нам и скажет, который в очках. Давай, давай, давай.
Шла
Но уже шла начинается, нет.
I asked Chukovsky about the schools and what he thought they should stress in their teaching.
Я не знаю, я, к сожалению, не знаю школы, и вот, может быть...
Unfortunately, I don't know the schools, but perhaps you should ask one of these children what they would like improved.
Что бы вы хотели?
Oi, they all know, but they keep quiet.
Да, нет, надо, конечно...
Well, of course, they should teach literature better. They should not assign rote learning of bad verse. They should have better aesthetic training. Things are already moving in that direction.
Ilya Ehrenburg, like Chukovsky, grew up before the revolution. As a young man, he lived in France and made friends with Picasso, from whom he acquired over the years a stunning collection of paintings and drawings which hang in his Moscow apartment, together with some unusual works of Russian art. Ehrenburg was a controversial man. Many people wondered how he managed to survive when so many Jewish writers perished in the Stalin purges. His life poses the central question for all intellectuals and artists under the Soviet system. Where is the line beyond which compromise destroys the soul? In his final years, Ehrenburg emerged as a supporter of liberal trends in the arts. Last May, for example, he boycotted the Writers' Congress in Moscow, together with several other liberal writers. But even when he was under criticism at home, Ehrenburg was not one to pour himself out to the Western press. This was one of the last interviews he gave before his death in September.
У нас накануне революции
we had very much avant-garde intelligentsia on the eve of the revolution. An intelligentsia with great taste and culture. We had wonderful painters, good theater and literature. But only a small number of people read these books and went to the theater. The rest were a mass of illiterates who had no contact with culture. Then there began the work of broadening the cultural base. Inevitably, inexorably, the beginning of such a process, of course, proceeded at the expense of the profundity of culture. It began from the beginning of the revolution and ended only toward the end of the Second World War. Only then could we say that this process was finished and that the process of deepening the culture began. What helps and what hinders this process? The first to develop the culture of the emotions helps this process. The whole contemporary world now knows more than it feels.
Ilya Grigorich, do you think there will be another golden age in Russian literature?
Although my name, that is to say Ilya, is associated with Prophet Elijah, I have been wrong so often in my prophecies. I still don't want to make any prophecies at this point. I can only talk about things as they were and as they are, and not about them as they will be. In the first 15 years after the revolution, we had astoundingly good poetry. Poets like Mayakovsky, Pasternak, Anna Akhmatova. Now not one is left. Now the picture here is grayer. It's clear that artists mature more slowly now. For example, I think that Voznesensky has a poetic gift, but foreigners have gotten interested in Voznesensky and Yevtushenko not only more than they have ever been interested in our poets, but even more than they've been interested ever in any of their own. I believe Yevtushenko attracted more people in Paris than any other writer since Victor Hugo's funeral. Of course, this had to do not with the size of his talent, but with the interest now in young Russia. And so people go to see what kind of people they are, how they talk, how they shout, and how they fall in love.
Don't the borders of literature need to be broadened in subject matter so that the young people will not turn to underground literature?
Я не знаю, что вы называете подпольной литературой.
I don't know what you mean by underground literature. There are some things that aren't printed, and then they are printed. I want to say that it's not a question of limits. In general, there are no limits in art.
Вообще в искусстве границ.
But this is not my field. I have never been an editor or a member of an editorial commission. I have always turned down invitations to do so. I am interested in literature, not in literature about literature. You are now interested in precisely this letter. You are interested in our literature in a political context, using our internal difficulties for your own purposes. I say you, I don't mean you personally. You are a perfectly nice lady. But Westerners in general.
Всегда уклонялся от предложений.
How much I used to talk about Pasternak in the West and say what a wonderful poet he was. And no one, I couldn't convince anyone that he was a remarkable poet. No one was interested until this Cold War incident happened. The Nobel Prize and so on. And suddenly everyone got interested. I want people to look upon our literature as literature and not as of a source of some kind of sensation. You should ask me about what people are writing and how people are writing and not about some kind of limit. I don't know anything about these limits. The hell with them.
Подходит к литературе.
Moscow's nearest equivalent of an off-Broadway theater is the Taganka, a fresh, brash, youthful, experimental theater of ideas and shock effects. Its guiding inspiration is Yuri Lubimov, who has set fire to a group of young actors, and they've been having a lot of fun with a living repertory. They've done some Brecht. They've worked up a production of John Reed's 10 Days That Shook the World, a broad simplification of the revolutionary days, whose action begins right in the theater lobby with songs from 1917.
Моя публика, песня о дрянтеле генерале. Но исполнены печали, жали, голубые отвечали, жали, ах, бандитные сату, генерал Дрянтелев, показали бы примерно, как тебе мы служим верно, разумительно веждут. Сохрани, Господь, убьют на такое заявление левее. Без смущения, ощущения. Христа, навались на нигилиста, листа, навались на него, и не пик ничего, и не пик ничего. Очень доблестная рать, столицу перебрать, рыли, пили, все же всех и перебили. Показали мы им то, опрокинули Господь. Оба! Ча-ча-ча! Между нами.
Another Taganka production that has been enormously successful is a dramatic recitation of Andrei Voznesensky's poems Anti-Miri, Anti-Worlds, which has captured the mood of this company of youthful actors. His themes are modern ones, ranging from the poignant loneliness of an American striptease dancer to the soulless bureaucrat in Soviet society, to the strong spirit of the early Lenin days.
Этот гольф, тот повержен бриджем. Жаль, просаживал дурачки. Под распарившимся Парижем Ленин режется в городки. Раз! Распахнута рубашка. Раз! Прищуривался глаз. Раз! Печурки вверх тормашками. Раз! Печатались письма. Разлетаясь до облаков. Так что вздрагивали висмарки от подобных городков. Раз! По тюрьмам по двуглавым. Ого-го! играла озорно и широко. Раз! Врезалась бита белая, как авроровский фугас. так что дребезги империи, церкви, будущей империи. Раз поиграл, таких оттягивал паровозов, так играл, что шарахались речь, так и в 45-м набывал. Раз.
Our cameras recorded under difficult conditions an unusual occasion at the Taganka, the 200th performance of Antimiri on July 2nd, at which Voznesensky came out on stage at the end of the evening. The occasion was given heightened tension and excitement by the fact that Voznesensky had just been blocked by the Soviet authorities from a proposed trip to the United States to read his poetry at Lincoln Center. And he had reacted to this denial in a defiant spirit by writing a letter to Pravda attacking bureaucratic control over the arts. Many people in the audience had already heard through the grapevine about the letter, and there was an instant bond between poet and audience. And people waited to hear what Voznesensky would say. He paid tribute to the creative spirit of Yuri Lyubimov, who was at that moment lying very ill in the hospital. And then Voznesensky began to recite his poems, some of them not yet published. What brought on the audience laughter was a section in the poem in which a movie director who is about to present his film for judgment to the members of a government commission takes a large swallow of contraceptive pills, just in case, he says, because they are many and I am alone. Voznesensky must have known that 2 days later he was to appear before 14 guiding members of the Writers' Union who tried to get him to retract his letter to Pravda. After his poetry reading, we talked with Voznesensky.
I think that only was the poetry has only one way to go directly and more deep inside of spirit of so-called in Russian we like word soul, yes?
Yes.
И я думаю, этим объясняется популярность и необходимость.
And I think that this is what explains the popularity and need for poetry in our country. It goes deeper and deeper into the human soul, into consciousness, which in the final analysis is the center of civilization.
Tell me, what are the young people of 20 like today?
I'm happy to say just now that we have a lot of, not one or two or three, a lot of talented young poets. They're maybe more happy than we.
Perhaps they're better educated. They grew up and were formed at a better time. For example, recently a 20-year-old by the name of Vladimir Gubanov came to see me. He's a pipe fitter by trade, but he loves Lorca, the early Aragon, Mayakovsky and Pasternak, of course. He writes complex intellectual poetry, and the fact that he's a worker doesn't prevent him from doing this.
It is a very strange paradox that in Russia, very deep and very difficult art, difficult kinds of arts began mass culture. You understand me?
Yes.
And for example, poetry, and for example, such a
one could make a parallel with such sciences as physics, which is complex in itself, but which penetrates the very pores of the popular masses. And so poetry, it doesn't cease to be complex, necessary, philosophical, just because it becomes accessible to the masses. And I think that this is the only kind of poetry that people need.
I have the impression that the scientists here, the Uchonian,
yes,
are very active in supporting the new movements in the arts and in literature.
Yes.
Tell me about this.
Yes. And I want to answer why. Because such a young physics, young chemics and mechanics and others, they have in their work a lot of complicated problems, and their mind is a very complicated thing, and that is why they wanted in art the same problems, the same kinds of art like physics problems in their work, and that is why I think the main part of, for example, of my audience is this young physics, mechanics, and technical intelligence.
Do you feel that some young people, before the complex problems of the world, have a tendency to take refuge in their own private lives, feeling perhaps that there is not much that they can do to influence the solution of problems? Do you notice this here?
You think, as you know, that maybe for Russia, for so-called mystery Russian soul, the main line in Russian soul is connection with not only his own, but with the whole world and so on. Я даже не. For example, я думаю, что вот всегда.
I think that always for Russian young people, the least characteristic have been questions of daily life, questions limited by some kind of narrow materialistic circle. Russian youth has always, and now this is particularly characteristic, has always been connected with the fate of the planet. But I'll tell you that in order for a man to do something for the planet, he must, for a while, at one time or another in his life, go deeply into himself, like a bear that sleeps a part of the time in order to lead a more active life during the rest of the time. And the same is true of a creative personality. I know many of our writers who live a very active life and then suddenly disappear for 3 months into the provinces. They do this in order to find themselves, to be born again, and these processes have to take place in private. But as to Russian youth, I would say that they've always been linked by every nerve with the whole world. And they were less, that is to say, Russian young people, less for themselves than for the whole world. They had a particularly self-sacrificing attitude about it.
In many countries of the world, there is much talk of so-called alienation among young people. And some people feel that this is perhaps a prelude to a new period of creativity among young people. What would you say about that?
I hope that it will be only prelude for explosion and many great. Because as I want, sorry, I am tired for English.
I hope that God grant this will be the period of an explosion of unprecedented creative energy. We must hope for this, because if we don't hope, why live? You end up a skeptic, a cynic, a pessimist, and most of all, it prevents you from working.
What about the young people who are not poets, that is, your audiences? Do you have much opportunity to meet with them and to feel what themes interest them? What kind of an approach do they have to life?
No,
if you can answer a little bit in English, it will help.
It is difficult because I'm tired after my reading
Fine,
and all my English words jumped out of my mind and only Russian. I want to say only one thing about the young generation, that they are better, more free, more brave, more stronger, and I believe in this generation. And every young generation is future, but it is possible to be bad future or good future. But I think that our generation is the best future. I think so.
In his art, Andrei Voznesensky reaches out to the world of science, where he feels the creative spirit is strong. One man who has shown this spirit in large measure is Igor Tamm. Indeed, he's been a major participant in the growth of Soviet science, and he's won a Nobel Prize. What is appealing about Tamm is his capacity for detached thinking that carries over into the broad aspects of life.
I should say that, in my opinion, the most important problem of humanity is the following one. Science and technology do develop extremely quick and give immense power in the hands of man. But this power can be used for good and for evil. But the most important thing is that the psychology of man, the inborn instincts, are at present almost the same as they were in the primitive man. But if a primitive man could, with the bow and spear could kill 15 or 20 people, now a hydrogen bomb can kill 15 or 20 millions of people. And the problem, I don't know how to deal with it, but the outstanding problem is how to change the instincts, the psychology of man. And the problem of ethics, the problem of moral, is the outstanding problem of humanity. Because otherwise, this immense power given by science and technology, but we will use it for the destruction of mankind.
50 years is a short time in the life of a society, and it is just 50 years since Russia was turned upside down. From the human standpoint, the picture there now is one of great achievements and great costs, and much that is yet to be done to fulfill people's hopes. There is optimism in the Soviet Union about the prospects for economic reform. Yet at this moment, no one can predict how far and how deep the reforms will have to go to be successful. Nowhere is the paradox more evident between the achievements and the limitations of this society than in the field of Soviet science. It has had some of the most spectacular gains, and also some of the most crippling inhibitions imposed by political control. Soviet cultural life has had its ups and downs, and for the past 2 years we have been in one of the down periods. The solidarity of the writers and artists keeps pressing to widen the latitudes of free expression. But here again, one comes back in the final analysis to the question of whether Soviet political control, by its very nature, can allow the real flowering of this talented culture. Now, in a sense, it can be said of any society that it is unfinished in realizing its stated ideals. But this carries special force in the case of the Soviet Union because its leaders claim to have found the model for the future for all societies. And so one must conclude of Russia's revolution that it is unfinished in terms of its original aspirations and in its task of modernizing the society. And above all, unfinished in the sense of coming into harmony with the talents of the Russian people themselves.
А заряда на нам лайф, дай тащи ребята в часть. Если где сопротивление, форту бей без промедления. Сам он третий генерал, отвечает на скандал, он скандал. Но исполнены печали, печали, голубые отвечали, печали. Ах, отец из донцов, генерал Задрителев, показали вы примерно, как тебе мы служим верно, да сумнительно лишь тут. Сохрани, Господь, убьют, убьют. На такое заявление, Шире. Христа, навались на нигилиста, листа, навалить на него и не пить ничего, и не пить ничего. Нельзя, нельзя. Очень добрая разница, столицу перебрать, рыли, пили, тоже всех и перебили. Показали боевко, опрокинули Господь. Ура!
This has been NET Journal, a weekly look at the events, issues, and people of the world today.
This is NET, the National Educational Television Network.